All right, well, welcome in everyone. As I'm sure, obviously, most of you are aware, the preseason has concluded with the Bulls playing their final game last night against the Grizzlies and are now set to open their season on Wednesday in Detroit against the Pistons. And what better time as we near the regular season to hear from our very own Bulls insider, a return guest actually, and Rob Schafer of NBC Sports Chicago. Rob, it's good to have you back on the show, man. Appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, and it's good to be back. I appreciate the invite. It's always good to chop it up about Bulls basketball, and never more timely than now with the season about to get underway.
For sure, absolutely. Now, the last time I had you on, I think it was around probably end of July. It was shortly before the draft. Since then, a lot has happened with the Bulls roster, to say the least. Really a complete overhaul of the roster, if you will. And I do want to talk about free agency, but because we just wrapped up the preseason, a very fun and exciting game last night, by the way. I really didn't feel like a preseason game at all. You're very close to the team and following them along in training camp. I did want to start there. What have been sort of your first impressions of this new look Bulls roster based on what we've seen in training camp? Has there been anything that's really stood out to you or surprised you right off the bat?
Yeah, I think for general takeaways, offensively, you've seen the potential that it looked like they were going to have on paper with all the playmakers that they now have on the roster. Obviously, Lonzo Ball, DeMar DeRozan here. In terms of shot creators, ball handlers, guys that can be trusted with the rock in their hands, that's just a level of talent that the Bulls have not had, especially on the perimeter in recent years outside of Zach LaVine. So the offensive potential and the ability to play fast, I think, has borne out in certain stretches, although as Billy Donovan will tell you, there have been times where the flow has gotten disrupted too, and they're still kind of hammering out some chemistry issues here and there. The thing that stood out to me as a surprise has been defensively. It hasn't been perfect, and it's still, I think, the biggest question mark surrounding this team going into the season in regards to if they're going to be able to reach their ceiling or how good they're going to be able to be. But the vision is becoming apparent to me in the sense that 1 to 4, you can play guys that are decent size for their position. They're obviously going to be a little undersized at power forward, but 1 to 3 between Lonzo Ball, Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, Caruso off the bench, Troy Brown Jr. off the bench, and so on and so forth. The Bulls are going to be able. They're going to be able to fly around a little bit, maybe make a little bit more chaos and mayhem, switch a little bit more than they were able to do last year. Maybe be a little bit more fast and versatile. So again, they're going to give up a lot of size defensively. Rebounding is a big question, but their ability to force turnovers and get out on the break and disrupt opponents' rhythm has been an encouraging sign for me. Obviously, it's only the preseason, but the formula for how this team can be good defensively, at least, has been laid out. Whereas before, I wasn't exactly sure how they were going to piece this thing together. At least now I can see it. And then within that, Lonzo and Caruso to me have been, probably the two most impressive guys on that end of the floor. And, we knew they were going to come in and make some level of impact defensively. But even I think, have been, impressed even more than their reputations would indicate with how significant their contributions have been. So those have been the general takeaways. Other than that, I mean, this team is just going to be fun. They're going to be high octane. Like I said, they're talented. So, from a reporter's perspective and certainly from a fan's perspective, that's refreshing, regardless of how things shake out.
Yeah, I saw you were at the game last night, based on some of the videos you were posting on Twitter. What was the atmosphere like, and was it noticeably different, at least from what you can remember pre-COVID days, when fans were allowed in the stadium, which is probably around the time when you first started at NBC Sports Chicago.
Yeah. So that's the thing. I've never covered a preseason with fans in the building at the United Center. I came in 15 or so games in the 1920 season, and then last year, obviously, the arenas were empty at the start of last year. So I don't have anything to compare it to from a coverage perspective in a preseason specific context. But certainly, I mean, it felt to me like there was a good deal more electricity than you would expect from a preseason game. Now, part of that is the Bulls and Grizzlies both played their starters and their key players until about midway through the fourth quarter. So it's not as if these were, this was a G League game playing out. Like Ja Morant was out there, Jaren Jackson Jr. was out there going off. And then on the Bulls end, all of their stars played deep into the fourth quarter too. So there was definitely a little bit more buzz than I think you might expect. And really, I mean, things ratcheted up to its highest level at the end when it was Caruso and Alize Johnson and Dosunmu kind of leading that charge that ultimately, they pulled Donovan pulled their starters when they were up 1, I think at about the 8-minute mark, and the Bulls ended up winning by 13. So they were really getting after it towards the end of the fourth quarter, and the fans got behind them for that. But, even in the down years, when there have been those little glimpses of light here and there, those good wins that kind of sporadically get dotted throughout a season, even the worst ones, you see the electricity that the United Center can still have. And I think there will be more nights where, that shines through than not this year. And certainly more than there have been over the last few years.
Yeah. You were talking about the end of the game last night, after the starters were pulled, and we saw something similar in the Cavs game, the second Cavs game, where, the starters are pulled, which is expected. You aren't going to see the starters, playing deep into the fourth quarter. And I think most fans probably assumed, probably not going to be able to get a win out of this one because the games were so close. And they just dominated. They did so well, especially, I was very impressed by Ayo and just his level of confidence in those type of moments. Again, it is just preseason, and I think we always have to remember that. But to be able to come in as a rookie and play at that level, knowing that the game is on the line and you're able to show up in that way, I was really happy to see that.
Yeah, the thing about Ayo, there's going to be a learning curve for him, but the quick thing I'd say on him is the way Zach LaVine describes him is fearless. And in terms of stepping up in big moments, and also like just little things like getting to the rim, not shying away from contact, like as much as there are going to be growing pains for him, I think that quality for him coming in is going to serve him well. And you see that down the stretch of these games. And, it's a crowded backcourt, but hopefully he gets some opportunity to show that, because I'll tell you what, in terms of guys check in, Caruso always gets a big applause when he checks in, which I think is kind of funny because he's a new guy. And he's even said, like, I hope I can actually live up to that at some point. Like, I know people just kind of treat me as a meme, but, he's looking to live up to that at some point. But Ayo, every time he checks in, gets a massive applause from the United Center crowd. People recognize what he kind of means to this city and the overlap between University of Illinois and the Bulls. So hopefully he gets more opportunities to shine through there, because he's certainly ready for the big moments mentally, even if physically there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve.
Absolutely. So we obviously got to see Patrick Williams for the first time last night in his preseason debut after suffering that ankle injury, which was great to see him back and looking healthy, and also coming back earlier than anticipated. Now, hopefully this means that he'll be potentially fully ready to go regular season without minutes restriction. But, when I heard about the news about Patrick Williams getting injured, my initial reaction was, yes, it's only 4 to 6 weeks, and obviously he's already returned. He's going to be ready to go regular season. But at the same time, this was kind of a critical offseason for him, right? Last year, because of the unique situation with COVID, he didn't have a full offseason. He got drafted and was then starting in a regular season game a month later. This was going to be an opportunity for him to really get run under this new roster. And now you have him missing a good portion of training camp of the preseason. Last time we spoke, we talked about how this is going to be a critical season for Patrick. Do you think that there are any concerns of him yet again not having the benefit of a full training camp, or do you think in the long run it's just not really going to have much of an impact on his performance this season and his development?
Yeah, I don't know that the Bulls are concerned about it. I guess we can see how it plays out. Obviously, there's going to be a ramp up period where he has to get his conditioning back and get his feel back. And the thing that Billy has been most disappointed about talking about Patrick throughout training camp is that the Bulls really feel like internally that he had a great offseason, just between the skill development he was able to do, from the shape he was able to get himself into conditioning wise, and then you have these kind of experiences playing for the Team USA select team, going up against the Olympic team that went and played in Tokyo in practices and things like that, and then going to Summer League and showing the flashes that he showed there. So I think that's been the most disappointing part for the Bulls about Pat missing a lot of training camp in the preseason. It's a good thing, all things considered, that he was able to get into that last preseason game. I don't know that there's concern that it's going to linger, especially because with Pat, as important as he is, I think he really is an X factor to this team, even with all the changes made, because at that 4 spot, he's going to have a lot of burden on him, especially defensively, to cover gaps and fill holes that others might not be able to. But there is a good deal of pressure off of him offensively. So at least he's not going to be overly relied upon in that way. And he can kind of bring himself along slowly in that regard. But yeah, we'll just have to see. I don't anticipate any kind of strict minutes limit for him coming into the season. He'll be in the starting lineup, for the season opener. I think him, getting back against Memphis and at least getting out there, he said he had moments where his conditioning kind of wore on him a little bit, but as the game went on, he felt a little bit better. And now the Bulls, the benefit is they do have 5 days between the preseason finale and the regular season opener to continue to ramp him up. So I think it's all positive for Pat. I think the fact that he got back on the front end of that return timeline is good. It's obviously not ideal for him to have missed a lot of training camp, but given the circumstances, I think it's better that he was able to get back for one preseason game and for sure for the start of the regular season. Whereas when that news first came out, it was like, oh man, could he miss 3-4 games? Could he miss 7 games?
Yeah.
So I think the Bulls have to take everything with him as positive right now, and we'll see how things play out in the regular season. I think he looked okay last night. I mean, offensively, he wasn't super involved, but when he did get his touches, I thought he was at least decisive. Like that's what the Bulls want from him when he gets catches, like either shoot or drive closeouts and make decisions quickly. And then defensively, he had some nice moments on Jaren Jackson Jr. I mean,
he had a monster block.
Yeah, that's going to be, to me, that's where he's going to make his biggest impact. And then offensively, it's kind of fill gaps where you can. But I still think Pat is one of the most important players to this team this year, and it's good that he's back for the start of the regular season for that reason.
Yeah. Speaking of the 4 spot, I did want to talk a little bit about Alize Johnson. You wrote a piece on him recently, which was a great read for those who haven't had a chance to read it. I'll leave it linked in the description here. But in that article, you were talking about how Alize has really been unleashing his inner Dennis Rodman and studying old film tape of the Worm to try to emulate his game. And honestly, we've kind of seen that, in the limited time that he's been playing in the preseason with his hustle and effort and the way that he's just bodying up guys, boxing people out and fighting for those rebounds and giving the Bulls more second chance opportunities. I'll admit, I wasn't too sure about the Alize signing when it was first announced, just because he really hadn't played that many games in the NBA. I think it's like around 49 games. But, not only do I think he will make the roster, but I think it's possible he's going to earn himself a spot in Billy Donovan's rotation just because the Bulls are a little, depleted at the 4 spot. Do you think, with what you've been able to see and the Bulls being limited at the 4 spot, like I said, that Alize could actually find himself getting some significant minutes this season?
Definitely. I think he's well positioned to crack the rotation at various points. What's interesting about the front court, the way it's breaking out for the Bulls right now, though, is Alize spent, because Tony Bradley, I mean, we mentioned Patrick Williams making his debut. Tony Bradley also hadn't played in preseason until the finale last night. What's interesting about Alize's situation is he was playing the 5 for the first 3 preseason games, primarily backing up Vooch, and I thought looked pretty good. I mean, again, competition is not at the highest level it was going to be even in a preseason context. And, the Pelicans were shorthanded. Cleveland was shorthanded in their second game. But I thought he looked pretty good there. Obviously, Billy had enough faith in him to treat him as Vucevic's primary backup. But what Billy was saying pregame last night was that he's kind of still evaluating what Alize Johnson looks like as a 4 in the Bulls system, because there are subtle differences between the 4 and the 5. Like the Bulls like to use their 5s kind of out on the perimeter as distributors from the elbows and things like that. And I think they're kind of still evaluating defensively. There are different responsibilities between like switching and dropping between the 4 and the 5. I think the Bulls are still evaluating whether, for their purposes, Alize Johnson is best served as a 4 or a 5. Last night, for example, he didn't really get out until I don't want to say garbage time because the game was still close, but he wasn't in the 9-man rotation last night. It was kind of Tony Bradley took that backup center turn. So it wouldn't surprise me if the Bulls are kind of still evaluating that, because they just got their first look at Tony Bradley in game action. He looked okay. I mean, he didn't look great, but there's rust to shake off. So I'm willing to give him a little bit of grace there and kind of see how that develops. But the one thing you're getting from Alize is hustle, and like he's going to be on the ground diving for loose balls. He's going to be somehow vacuuming in rebounds over guys that he's given up 4 or 5 inches to on the interior. So I think he certainly has the potential to be a fan favorite, regardless of what his precise minutes load ends up being. And, if, injuries persist in the front court or pop up in the front court, or maybe he just ends up outplaying Tony Bradley for stretches of the season, I could absolutely see him cracking the rotation, because all he's done with every, slice of opportunity he's gotten is produce with it. Like even last night, I think he got in for 7 or 8 minutes and he had 6 points and 5 rebounds. Just like out of nowhere. The dude grinds, and he sneakily does. I know he gives up a lot of size, but the Bulls are going to be giving up a lot of size anyway. Like they kind of have to bake that into their identity. He does fit with this mindset that the team wants to play with of, versatility. He can handle the ball a little bit and pass. He can get up and down the floor. He's pretty fast, especially playing from those big spots. So I could see him winning Billy's trust over the course of the season, but it's just a matter of, how Tony Bradley looks over the course of time, injuries, and, whether they deem him, whether they think that they're able to play him at the 4 full time, because I think they're still evaluating that. But to answer your original question, no, it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up, playing 15 to 20 minutes a night for this team and making an impact at some point throughout the season.
Now, unless I missed it, because I know you have much closer insider connections, obviously, than I do. It hasn't been confirmed yet that he has, in fact, made the team, or that he's on a fully guaranteed deal as of right now. Is that correct?
So rosters are due on Monday, so I guess
Yeah,
it wouldn't
that's okay.
be official until then. But Adrian Wojnarowski, obviously, is as reliable as it gets. Reported that the Bulls converted Tyler Cook's
Tyler
non-guaranteed
Cook.
deal to be a two-way. So the Bulls only two guys left that were among that kind of non-guaranteed crew are Matt Thomas and Alize Johnson. They have to be at 14 at the very least, and my money would really, really be on Alize getting that first of the final two roster spots. So I think he's as safe as it gets to bet that he's going to be on the roster come opening night. And like we were talking about, I mean, he has the potential to break into the 9 or 10 man rotation even on top of that.
No, absolutely. And I mean, as I mentioned, I think, I fully expect him to make the roster. I don't see if there's any doubt in my mind that he wouldn't. So it really leaves only one final roster spot left, right? Initially, I think most people assumed that it was going to be Stanley Johnson, but of course, we just learned earlier this morning that he was in fact waived. And of course, as you mentioned, Tyler Cook received a two-way contract. So that really leaves us with Matt Thomas, who has showed up well in the preseason. And you would think that, he would likely get that final roster spot for the Bulls. But of course, I mean, the Bulls could also just leave that spot open, right, for an opportunity later on in the season. I think most people are wondering, and maybe it's really more me, is adding Matt Thomas, by doing that, how would we fit him into the system with the crowded backcourt the Bulls already have, especially when Coby White comes back? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think he's just insurance. I mean, I think he's just a guy that, the Bulls know better than anybody that injuries take hold over the course of an NBA season, and it puts you into, especially in the COVID era. I mean, it'll be less this year with the vaccine being more prevalent for the full course of the season as opposed to last year. But
Right.
By the end of the preseason, we were talking off air, and Stanley was, I think, viewed as a favorite to get one of those final two roster spots entering camp, just because of his pedigree, being a former, top 8 pick. And, he hasn't always produced throughout his NBA career, but is a pretty good athlete, can play the 4. That was thought of a position of weakness for this team. But by the end of the preseason, I mean, like you said, Matt Thomas came in. He was a spark at the end of games throughout this 4-game slate. If anything, in his kind of limited NBA opportunities that he's gotten, he's proven to be a pretty elite shooter. This regime has obviously valued outside shooting pretty highly since they've taken over in Chicago. So it makes sense. I mean, even with Coby White out, I am not sure that he steps in with a rotation role ready made for him, because even in the preseason, he wasn't really getting trotted out there until late in games after the starters got pulled. But as an insurance option, as kind of a deep reserve that you can call upon if you are in dire straits, I think you could do worse, just because he has NBA experience. He's shown an ability to really shoot it well from the outside. And clearly, I mean, he impressed the Bulls throughout preseason and training camp with the way he works. So I don't think that necessarily means that, with the Tice exception, that they wouldn't make a move if one presented themselves throughout the year. It's kind of a low risk, I don't even want to say high reward, but just a low risk move that can be, you can be flexible with him at any point throughout the season. But it does look like, if they do fill that last roster spot, that he's going to be the one that inhabits it. And like I said, I think the Bulls could do worse. They could do better, but I don't, with that spot, you're not necessarily bringing in a guy that's going to be an automatic rotation player. And as far as insurance goes, I think Thomas is just fine in that regard.
For sure. Now, I have to ask about the Lonzo Ball tampering investigation. To be honest, I feel like most of us had really kind of forgot about it because it's been so long now. I think most of us thought that. Yeah. Even KC mentioned it. This was on one of your Bulls Talk podcasts around the time of the investigation when it started, that you would have to think that this investigation would be over and done with by the time training camp rolls around. And yeah, here we are. Preseason is already done. The Bulls play their first game in 4 days, and no updates. Do you anticipate a verdict, if you want to call it that, will come down in the coming days, especially with the season starting next week? Or do you have any insight into the latest on the investigation itself? I know people were asking about it on media day, and obviously Arturis is not going to say anything about it, but are you surprised that the investigation is still ongoing?
Yeah, it's been a while, right? And so I guess I would say I'm surprised that not only has it not been resolved, there really hasn't been any movement on it. So
Right.
that is a little bit surprising given the timeline. In terms of if I expect it to come to fruition over the next few days, it's been quiet. Like, I think this is really going to be something that kind of drops in out of nowhere. And yeah, I mean, the Bogdanovich, which is pretty much the closest precedent that we could work off, because it was a similar situation, not the same, but similar. And that, investigation came to pass after the NBA instituted all these new regulations around tampering and kind of wanted to emphasize it and make it more of a point of emphasis to keep teams away from doing it. That was resolved, I think, a day or two before the start of the regular season last year. So, it would stand to reason that it could get resolved in the next couple of days, but I can't say I know just because it's been so quiet on it. I really do think it's something that's just going to get dropped in, and all the Bulls can hope for, the Bulls can hope that they're not found guilty. That would be the first thing you'd hope for. And if they are, you just hope that the penalty isn't too severe. But at this point, I mean, I remember when that news first broke and there was, fan consternation over, oh my God, is the sign and trade going to get reversed or anything like that? Like, at least we're well beyond that point. Lonzo Ball is a Bull. He's going to stay a Bull. And I think the worst case is a first round draft pick gets docked. And that's when you're happy that the Bulls were able to swing a first rounder from Portland in that Lauri Markkanen sign and trade, which I still think was a pretty, amazing feat to pull off. So we'll see how it resolves. I can't say that I have any insight on the timeline. We'll just have to see when it happens. But if it was resolved soon, just with the start of the regular season coming up, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, and that's what I was just gonna say about the Lauri Markkanen trade and that first round pick. I mean, you could kind of almost view that as insurance in the event that they are found guilty in this investigation, that they do in fact have to give up a first round pick. Obviously, it would still be very unfortunate. I think no one wants that to happen, but I think the reason why people have kind of forgotten about it, like you said, is that we got Lonzo Ball, and that's kind of all people really care about. He's already playing, and he's playing well, doing in the preseason. So I think more wondering whether or not this, like you said, will just kind of come down out of nowhere, unanticipated, unexpected, and we'll see. I mean, I think maybe the no news is good news in a way, that you would think that something would have come out by now if they had actually found something, and it means that they're really doing their due diligence, and maybe they're just not coming up with anything. But had to ask, because it's like a topic that people are still wondering about, but also slowly forgetting about. So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about free agency. Very active free agency the Bulls had. The last time we met, like I said, we talked about the need for the Bulls to upgrade at the point guard position. Obviously, the long time rumor of Lonzo Ball coming to the Bulls, finally came to fruition. Then, of course, the Bulls signed Alex Caruso, and then executed another sign and trade for DeMar DeRozan, of course, among other transactions. But with all of these moves, was there any specific move in your view that surprised you or caught you off guard?
Yeah, well, Lonzo obviously that wouldn't qualify because that had been rumored forever, and they were after him hard at the deadline last year. So the fact that came to fruition wasn't a surprise to anybody inside the NBA or outside of it. Even Caruso, I mean, they had been linked to him. I had kind of assumed that was a fallback option to one of their primary options in Lonzo, but I think getting him for the mid-level and getting him to play the role that it looks like he's going to play, where he's kind of one of the trusted top 6 or 7 rotation guys, could be in closing lineups, could be in high leverage situations. That makes a ton of sense for him. So I wouldn't say that surprised me. I think those moves coming in the first day or two of free agency, and then the DeMar DeRozan sign and trade coming down the pipe later as kind of a cherry on top of everything. Yeah. That was honestly, that was a surprise to me. And then when you learn afterwards, okay, the Mark Eversley connection was big there. The market had kind of dried up for DeMar DeRozan, and the Bulls, had by far the most financially lucrative offer. And then you kind of dig into, okay, how's he going to fit offensively? Oh man, he's really grown into a pretty terrific distributor in San Antonio. The Bulls need that. They need half-court playmaking, reliable half-court playmaking. They need a guy that can get to the rim, can get to the foul line. A veteran guy that's been, on deep playoff runs in Toronto, has been around, has been on successful teams. So it makes all the sense in the world, but for them to actually pull that off and bring in, again, like I said, on top of Lonzo Ball and guy DeMar DeRozan, who those two, I mean, they have to be two of the, biggest 4 free agent signings in franchise history, 2 of the biggest 3 free agent signings. Franchise. That to me, when that news came down the pipe, that bowled me over for sure. And then when the details of the signing trade come out and the scope of it, to get off of Al-Farouq Aminu, you lose Thad, which stings a little bit, lose another first round pick. It was like, oh man, the Bulls are really serious. Like, we knew they were serious, but they are really, really serious. So I think that's the one that surprised me the most. And still, I mean, when you look at those five between Zach, DeMar, Vooch, Lonzo, and Patrick Williams on the floor together, and even Caruso off the bench, it's like, I can't believe we're here now from where we started, a calendar year ago, what this roster looked like. So that was really the punctuating point to me of oh man, these Bulls are not your grandmother's Bulls or even your slightly older brother's Bulls. Like this is from 2 years ago to now, it's just been a complete 180 turn.
Yeah. It's you're talking about all these offseason moves. There was one that maybe was a non move that was made this offseason that I don't think people are talking about as much, and it's about Zach LaVine. More specifically, his upcoming free agency. You actually wrote a really great piece on that. I think it was a couple weeks back or so about his contract extension and how it wasn't reached this offseason. But them, not coming to terms doesn't take away from the fact that either sides, they're still committed to one another, And I like that you emphasize that because, of course, the national media, namely ESPN, they kind of took that and sort of ran with it, saying that, Zach LaVine and the Bulls discussed a contract extension, but they couldn't find common ground. If anything, in my view, I think they did, in fact, find common ground, saying that, hey, let's start building this team now by not having to shed all this salary cap space to extend you this offseason. And then you also get paid significantly more next offseason for a 5-year max contract. Really a win-win for both sides, in my view. What's sort of your take on that? Maybe I'm being a little too lofty in that line of thinking. And do you think that there is any potential or concerns of the possibility of Zach not re-signing with the team?
No, listen. So the words unrestricted free agent are obviously scary. Like, anything can happen when you get to that point, and especially if the Bulls disappoint this season, anything can happen at that point. Sure. But I think the notion that because the Bulls and Zach LaVine didn't reach an extension agreement this offseason, that means that the Bulls are on notice, and Zach is testing out his other options, and he's treating this where he's got the Bulls on one end, but he's also, has eyes on greener pastures on other. I think the thing about Zach that maybe gets a little underrated is he's a really sharp guy. Like, he knows, what his worth is on the open market, like monetarily. He knows how massively underpaid he is, and he knows exactly what type of raise he's in for next offseason, whether it's the Bulls or anywhere else. And the other thing, and I talked to him about this in an interview I did for him at Team USA minicamp in Las Vegas back in July, which was obviously before the draft, before free agency, and when the extension was still a possibility. It wasn't as simple as the Bulls just handing him a contract with, a blank, a blank spot in next to, his signature or money on the dotted line or whatever. The Bulls were going to have to make some pretty significant sacrifices depth-wise, waiving players to get under the salary cap line enough to renegotiate and raise the salary. Not only do you sacrifice depth from last year's team, which wasn't good enough to begin with, you're also sacrificing the opportunity to make the external improvements that they ended up making with guys like Lonzo, DeMar, Caruso, even the guys they added later in free agency. Zach was aware of that even in the moment. He was pretty firm when I talked to him about wanting to be in Chicago, wanting to work something out to be here long-term, but also understanding that for it to happen right now, it would require compromising a lot of, avenues to improve the team this offseason. If you're a believer like I am that the most important thing to Zach LaVine at this stage of his career is winning, because he's never been on a winning team, he's never been to the playoffs. I think the route that the Bulls took is it a bit of a calculated gamble because this season has to play out and you need to get him to agree to a 5-year deal in free agency next offseason? Yeah, it's a bit of a calculated gamble, but I think the bet is that Zach LaVine cares enough not only about winning, but about winning in Chicago, that making these moves now is going to appeal to him down the line. I think that's a good way to play it, in my opinion. So I don't think that any of these moves were made without Zach LaVine's consult. They weren't made against his will. He was involved in recruiting DeMar DeRozan and Lonzo Ball to the Bulls. So like, he has a hand in all of these things. And the other thing that's worth remembering and that bears repeating is that when free agency rolls around next summer, the Bulls are going to have the ability to offer him a 5-year contract that no external team is going to be able to because they have his bird rights. Like, they're still well positioned to have him around long term. And I think because he was so involved in the process, he was giving input on some of the moves that they made this offseason. I don't think there's any reason to be up in arms about that at this point. Once the season starts to play out, who knows? When we hit free agency next offseason, who knows? But I don't think there's any reason to be concerned about that right now. Yeah. And, we should warn fans, like, there's going to be reports throughout the season.
Yeah.
There are going to be teams interested in Zach LaVine. Like, that's just, he's perhaps the biggest name on the market that's going to be there next offseason. And for as far as he's ascended to get to this point, he could even reach another level this season, playing with as much talent around him as he has in his NBA career. Like,
right.
There are going to be teams interested. There are going to be quote unquote potential suitors out there. But the perspective of the Bulls still being able to offer that extra year, the perspective of the relationships that Zach has in Chicago, and the fact that he's kind of repeated time and time again that he wants to be here long-term and win here long-term. And, combine all that with the input that he gave on the moves that the team made this offseason and his, them having his sign off on that. I don't think there's no reason to panic by any means at this point in regards to that.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of Bulls fans, when that came out, right, that there were these reports that they didn't agree to an extension. And I had talked about that on my channel as well. It's like, look, you guys, these reports are going to come out all year about teams being interested in Zach LaVine, how they're going to be pursuing Zach LaVine in free agency. And I think, if anything, what you were kind of just talking about is, again, they did find common ground. They found common ground in the sense that Zach was a part of all of these moves and these decisions to be able to improve the roster now and still set him up for success in the future when he becomes a free agent. Because like you mentioned, the Bulls are able to offer him more money than any other team. And that's enticing, for any player. And I think, the other thing that we had talked about the last time we met, it was shortly after you'd had that one-on-one with Zach LaVine. And you were talking about how genuine he was in just sort of his demeanor and approach for what the city of Chicago means to him and playing for the Bulls franchise. And I think that says something as well, right? You can kind of almost tell from body language how a player is feeling about their current situation. So I appreciated that. And I think that I don't really have any concerns. And like you said, we're going to be getting these reports all year long as far as trade rumors or free agency rumors and things like that.
Yeah, I really think the best way to look at it is it kind of was, as much as there is security in agreeing to that long-term extension now, that there's an element of that it's the best for both sides, because the Bulls got to massively improve their roster, and Zach LaVine has a little bit of flexibility long-term. He can kind of survey his options a little bit if he so chooses, but that max contract offer is still going to be waiting for him next offseason, no matter what, barring catastrophic injury, which, knock on wood. But he's been pretty durable since the ACL that he suffered earlier in his career. And, the thing that also gets a little bit under talked about is the Bulls' record improves if Zach LaVine sustains his production from what it was last season and he sneaks onto an All-NBA team. Like, maybe that max becomes a super max, and then he's really made the right call for himself. So,
right.
I don't think the framing that, the fact that they didn't come to an extension agreement means that either side is aggrieved with the other. I don't think that's right. I think both sides are pretty aware of the full scope of everything that needed to happen for the Bulls to improve this offseason, and they both have the perspective of both sides are still pretty well positioned to reach an agreement next offseason if they so choose. So I think that perspective is important when talking about that.
For sure. So let's talk about this upcoming season, then I'll end it there because I think your time is really valuable. But I want to talk about expectations for this team. There's been a lot of polarizing viewpoints, on the moves that were made in this offseason. You have a lot of people, particularly the national media, saying that they expect the Bulls to be a fringe playoff team. Some even saying that they might not even make the play-in because of how competitive the East will be this season, and because there are a lot of questions around the fit of this roster. Then you also have other people saying that this is going to be a top 3 team in the East, that the Bulls could potentially be title contenders, which I think is a bit lofty. But what are your expectations of this Bulls team in this season, and where do you think that they'll ultimately finish in the Eastern Conference?
Let me go right in the middle of those two outcomes, because I think that's usually where the truth lies, right? Is right in the middle of two extremes. I think they're, a 44 to 45 win team, 5 to 6 seed, 4 to 6 seed. I think that's totally a reasonable expectation for this group. The Eastern Conference, and particularly the middle class of the Eastern Conference, got a lot better this offseason. So there's going to be teams that they're in gridlock with throughout the year. I think mainly the Knicks, the Celtics. If you want to lump, the Pacers have had some pretty rotten injury luck. They could be in there. The Hornets, if they take another step. But I think the Bulls are pretty well positioned to be among the best of that group. And, I think reasonable for them is, after all the investment that they've made, 45 and 37, 5 or 6 seed out of the play-in. I think that's what I'll be looking for them. I don't want to say that if they were to fall in the 7-8 range of the play-in and then play it through and make the playoffs, I wouldn't call that like a massive disappointment, but to me that would be a a little bit under expectation. I expect this team to be a top 6 seed. And like I said, to have a winning record for the first time since I guess the 3 Alphas team was a 500 team. So I guess really since the Derrick Rose era.
Right.
Steps in the right direction, I think, is what is the biggest thing that I would expect this season. And then in terms of the win-loss record and the seeding, mid-40s, 5 to 6 seed.
Yeah, you and I run the same. So on my channel, I've talked about how I think the Bulls will finish with the 5th seed, probably around 46 wins. And you get a lot of fans saying like, why are you hating on the Bulls because they should be a lot better than that? But
that's seen as a negative opinion. Oh man.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, among Bulls fans, right? I think if you're talking about non-Bulls fans, they probably see that as a realistic opinion, or maybe even kind of overhyping it to an extent. But for me personally, I think that as great as they have looked in the preseason, and I was very impressed by what they showed in the preseason, I do still think that there is going to be a bit of a learning curve, just because you're talking about a completely new roster, guys that haven't played together before, learning a new system. I think there's going to be some challenging moments here and there, but I think ultimately they're still going to be a good team. I just don't think that title contenders, they're just not quite there yet. It doesn't mean that they won't be getting there in the near future. I think that with the new front office and the way that they've been aggressive thus far, you can certainly expect that they're going to continue being aggressive to be able to get to that point where they are title contenders. But that's sort of my take on it. I think either way, I'm definitely looking forward to this season. I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun for you guys to follow along with the team. I assume they're allowing you guys to travel with the team this year, or?
Yeah, so it's actually been great access so far. I mean, we've been back pretty much in our own seating, right on the old seating, I should say, right on the baseline, going to practices, shoot-arounds, in-person press conferences, post-game.
Nice.
And yeah, like traveling will be a thing. So
Nice.
It's definitely going to be a refreshing year compared to last season where everything was over Zoom, and nobody's complaining because the world went upside down there and still is kind of upside down. And we did what we had to do, but I think it's going to be a rich season in terms of getting information and pulling storylines from this team, because we're going to be a little bit closer and actually talking to guys face to face, et cetera, et cetera. So we are very excited for that. We got a little taste of that in the preseason, and excited to get rolling.
For sure. Well, Rob, I want to thank you again so much for taking the time out of your day to meet with us Bulls fans. I know it's obviously a very busy time for you guys in the media, during training camp, after the preseason. So I really do mean that. We're very thankful for all the work that you guys do, and not only reporting and covering the team, but also taking the time to talk to us fans like myself. So appreciate it, Rob, and hopefully stay in touch.
Yeah, 100%. Pleasure was mine. It's talking basketball, right? I wouldn't be in this job if it wasn't my favorite thing to do. So it's always a good time.